Hi there. My name is Neil McIsaac, and I'm a Microsoft Technical Trainer. In this video, we'll be covering how to deploy and consume models using the Azure Machine Learning Service. More specifically, we're going to be looking at how to deploy a model to a managed online endpoint, followed by how to deploy a model to a batch endpoint. So let's get started with deploying to a managed online endpoint. If you recall from one of our previous videos, an endpoint is used to expose an API for the model that can be reached over the HTTPS protocol. That way, an application can send an HTTP-based request with all of the input data and receive a response with the prediction back from the model. Online endpoints are used for real-time scenarios. In other words, we have an application that needs an immediate prediction. So for example, perhaps we have a website that needs to predict what is the best choice for advertising based on the browsing pattern of the customer. In order to service the request, we'll need some compute to host the endpoint. Earlier in this course, when we were talking about compute, you might remember that we have a couple of options that can be used to host our endpoint. We can host our endpoint as either a managed online endpoint or could host it within a Kubernetes cluster. Managed online endpoints are much easier to deploy since the Azure Machine Learning Service will manage all of the underlying infrastructure that will host our endpoint. So for this reason, we'll be focusing on that. If you're in a situation where you need more control over the hosting environment or need the ability to scale to much higher levels, then Kubernetes would probably be a better choice. We really have two different scenarios to deploy a model to a managed online endpoint. The first one is used with ML flow models that have been registered using an ML model file with the Azure Machine Learning Workspace. This is definitely one of the benefits of registering your model with a model file, because deploying is just a matter of specifying a few settings when we create the deployment for it. The other scenario is if we have a custom model. The thing with this one is that we need to do a lot more work. Specifically, we need to still register the model, but we'll need to do this a bit more manually by specifying all the necessary files, followed by creating a scoring script, which is needed to define how the request to the endpoint will communicate to the model and how the predictions will be sent back. We also need to define the execution environment, and then we can create the deployment and deployer model. One of the benefits of using the Azure Machine Learning Workspace to host our endpoints is that we have the ability to manage our endpoints. So we can do things like list all of the endpoints. We can see the details of the deployment logs of the endpoints. We can test our endpoints. We can manage the different versions of our the deployments that are deployed to the same endpoint. When you see on the slide here, we see a graphic with an example test against a specific deployment version for an endpoint. In this case, we can pass all of the necessary input data to our endpoint and see if we get the correct response back. You'll notice that the deployment version of the endpoint is set to blue. We can name our deployment versions whatever we like, but the blue name that is being used on the slide here is a great reference to the deployment's ability to do things like blue-green deployments with different versions. You know that they say a picture is worth 1,000 words, which makes me curious how many words a demo might be worth. So let's jump over to the portal and check out a demo on how to do an online deployment. All right, so looking at how to create an online endpoint here. So I have a notebook that's open, and we're going to use this to go and define and create our endpoint. And the first thing that we're really doing is defining the endpoint itself. We'll do deployments to this in a little bit, but so we use the managed online endpoint class, and we're going to give it a name, a description. We're going to, in this case, we have the authorization mode to set to be key-based. And we're going to set the name to be something dynamic. So we have a date time that's being added to the endpoint name. And we're going to run that to define the endpoint. We need to go deploy it here in a second. But so this is all done. It's pretty quick to do that. So let's come down a little bit, and we are going to create or update the endpoint and see what that result is. Now, the endpoint itself, you can sort of think as like a big label to say, hey, here's an endpoint. We're going to put deployments to it. So even though it says, by the way, this is a notebook that is out online, so we have these warnings in here to wait until the endpoint is created. But this actually doesn't take too long because there's not much there. So let's go talk about the deployment itself. The deployment is what does the work, right? So in order to do the deployment, we do need an ML flow model. So we see that we're defining our model here. We have like the model object, the deployment that we're going to use, managed online deployment. So different than the endpoint, right? Deployments go to an endpoint. So we define our model here. We give it a name. So in this case, blue. We're going to go with the blue-green sort of model. And we specify what endpoint we're going to deploy it to. Now, because the deployment does the work, we also need to define the compute for it. So we have the type of compute, we have the instance count, in this case just one, so we're going to keep it pretty low key. But you can scale this to be a lot more. Package all this up as a managed online deployment, right? So I think that looks pretty good for that. Let's go back here, see if our endpoint is done. So these usually don't take too long, but there we go, it's just finished, I think. It's a little slower in the notebook. Saw the notification, but the notebook's going a little bit slower. Should pop up here any second. There we go. So you can see that this is done. The provisioning state is succeeded. You can see that way over here. And so now we can come down. Once that's there, we can send a deployment to it, right? So for me, I think of those endpoints as a way of grouping deployments, right? These are all the deployments that kind of belong in the same category. So this is going to be the blue one. That was the definition. We need to deploy this as well, to go create the deployment to make it go. So when we run this, the begin, create, or update, this will take a little more time, right? So we see the creation here in progress, and this will take a little bit to go. So let's see a few other things here. One of the things we can do this later, is we can change the amount of traffic that goes to a deployment. Now, this is a kind of simple example here, but real world, I may have more than one deployment to the same endpoint. So think, blue, green, I could say that blue gets 50% and green gets 50%, and I can play with the traffic. Now, in this case, we only have one, but we're going to set it up so that 100% of the traffic is going to go to this deployment, right? It's the blue deployment on this endpoint, right? So we're just specifying which deployment to really use. So that one, that looks pretty good. Now we do need this to kind of finish before we really do that. So something else just while that's going, we'll talk about testing it, right? So testing it, we're going to go, once that's deployed, we'll invoke the endpoint. And in order to do that, we're going to send a sample JSON file. So let's go look at that. The sample JSON file is just really all the columns that we need to send into the model with its data. So for example, pregnancies here is, this data is 0 pregnancies for this one sort of row of sample data. And what we expect when we invoke it is to send that data to the endpoint and get that prediction back. So, based on the data, should the result be that they're diabetic or not? And we can see diabetic, if it returns a 1, they're diabetic, and if else, they're not diabetic. Okay, so again, it still takes some time for the deployment to go. So at this point, we're just really going to watch this for a little bit and wait for it to finish deploying, and then we'll see those other things test out. For those of you that are watching the recorded version of this course, we've sped up some of the video to save you some time. The typical wait for this can be much longer in real life. All right, finally, we have our notification that the deployment has completed, right? We see that Everything's come back. The provisioning state is succeeded as well. So that looks good. So let's come down and just go back to the code that we were talking about earlier. So as far as the traffic goes, we can say, hey, let's make sure that 100% of the traffic is there. And again, this makes more sense when we have multiple deployments, but I think you get the idea that we can play with what percent of the incoming traffic goes to which deployment. So not all of the incoming traffic necessarily goes to just one deployment. We can play with that. So this will take, this one doesn't take too long to really update that. Let's give that a minute. There we go. So that update's completed. We see the notification for it. So let's come down and do a test. All right, there we go. Just waiting for that to return. So, all right, provisioning state succeeded. So let's come down and test this deployment with some code. So I showed that sample data JSON file earlier. So let's just run this. We're going to send that data back and forth. And what do we get? The result is that the prediction is that this person would be diabetic. All right, so that gives you an idea of how to use these real-time endpoints. Let's jump back to the content and we'll talk about batch endpoints and what those look like. The other major option for deploying our model is to deploy it as a batch endpoint. So let's take a look at that next. Batch endpoints are different than online endpoints in that they're designed to process a batch of input data all at once. The endpoint is still an HTTPS-based endpoint, but where online endpoints are sent input data and receive a prediction back, a request to a batch endpoint is used to trigger the batch scoring job. In other words, we'll use this type of endpoint to basically say, go score that pile of data over there right now. A really useful scenario for this is that we could use it to trigger scoring from other services like Azure Synapse Analytics or Azure Databricks, since those services are really good at data engineering, which is all about data movement. So doing that ETL or ELT process, which is a big part of preparing data for model training, is very similar to what we might do to prepare data that needs to be scored by the model. Essentially, Azure Synapse Analytics or Azure Databricks can do all of that preliminary work to prepare the data that needs to be scored, and then call our batch deployment to tell the Azure Machine Learning Service to go score that data. Another difference between the online endpoint versus the batch endpoint is that when a batch endpoint is triggered, it actually creates a job that's submitted to the workspace to be executed. And you can see and monitor the job within the workspace. The first thing that we need to do is create the batch endpoint. We can create a batch endpoint using the Studio interface, using the GUI, or we can use code such as the Python SDK, like you see on the slide here. So in this code example, we're simply using the batch endpoint class, where we assign a name and a description to the batch endpoint, and then submit it using the begin, create, or update method for deploying batch endpoints. Next, we need to configure some compute for the batch endpoint to run. Because it's a batch endpoint, we need to configure a compute cluster to do the scoring of the data. We can configure this either in the Azure Machine Learning Studio, or we can do this with code. So in the example here, we see that we're just creating a compute cluster using the Python SDK, which is something that we looked at earlier in this course. Keep in mind that this compute will spin up, process all of the data, and then shut back down based on the idle timeout, which in this example is set to 120 seconds. Depending on your scenario, if you have a lot of data to process, you might want to configure both the size and the max instances to be higher values so that we can maximize the amount of parallelism when we're processing all that data. That might seem like it would be more expensive, but in a very general sense, if we use twice as much compute, but it takes half the time to actually accomplish the task, the cost is sort of roughly equal, very roughly. The reason why this can work is because we're only paying for the compute when it's running. The next thing that we need to do is to deploy the model to the batch endpoint. Similar to online endpoints, a batch endpoint supports multiple deployments that we can use for scenarios like versioning or blue-green deployments. That being said, we do need to specify one of the deployments to be the default deployment. The reason for this is because when the batch endpoint is called, the caller can specify which deployment should be used to score the data. So, for example, if we deploy two versions to our endpoint, so version 1 and version 2, the caller could choose to score the model using version 1 or version 2 when they make the request to the API. We need to have a default deployment set because the caller can leave off which deployment to execute when they submit the request. They don't have to specify version 1 or version 2. So if that happens, the batch endpoint will use the default deployment to do the scoring. If we're deploying an ML flow model to a batch endpoint, things get pretty easy. We simply have to configure the behavior on how the model will execute when it's called. So we need to specify things like instance count, which is the number of compute nodes that we want to generate for the predictions. The max concurrency per instance, which is the number of parallel scoring scripts that should be run on each computer node. The mini batch size, which is the number of files passed per scoring script when it's running. The output action, which specifies what we do with the predictions. So do we just have one single file summary of everything, or do we append the prediction to each row of input data? And lastly, we need to specify the output file name where we'll store the results. If we're deploying a custom model to a batch endpoint, then similar to online endpoints, we need to specify a scoring script, which is really about the details on how the data needs to be passed into the model to do the scoring. We also need to create an environment for this, which, if you recall from earlier in this course, defines the execution environment where the scoring script will execute. This way we can load any dependencies or required libraries that might be needed by the scoring script. The last thing we need to do is to create the deployment itself. If we're doing this using the Python SDK, we could use the batch deployment class to configure that deployment for us. Now, assuming that we've successfully deployed everything, we need to use our batch endpoint to do some scoring. This is a little bit different than what we would see for an online endpoint because we need to tell the batch endpoint where our data is for input. In the Python SDK example here, you can see an input variable being defined as a reference to a data asset that is of type URI folder. After that, we can invoke the batch endpoint by calling the invoke method. And of course, we need to pass the endpoint name and our data reference to the method. In this case, the input variable that was previously defined. Once the batch endpoint is invoked, we can see the job that spawns in the Azure Machine Learning Studio and see if it ran successfully or not. The predictions that it generates will be stored in the default data store. All right, so let's try and put all that together with a demo. All right, so let's look at going and working with a batch endpoint. So again, we're going to do this in a notebook. So the first thing we want to do is register the model. All right, similar to what we did with the online endpoint. So an ML flow model, nothing really different there. So let's get that registered. So that doesn't take too long. It's pretty quick. And then we're going to create a batch endpoint. And again, batch endpoints are similar to the online endpoints. And I mean that like in the endpoint context, where we're going to give it a name, right? So we have a name for this. So we're just modifying it a little bit so we have a unique name for it. And then we're going to define the endpoint itself. And the endpoint is really like that label, if you will, to where deployments go. So this part, we're going to create the batch endpoint using the class. There's the name, description, and we're just going to create it. There's nothing really that different than what we did earlier with the online endpoint. So think this package. So the creation's going. It's completed. It's that quick for it. Really just a quick definition. Now, here's where the magic happens. create the deployment, similar with the online deployments. This is where we're defining where all the work's being done. But in this case, it is a batch deployment. So we're going to specify a little bit more than the other one. We're going to use the batch deployment constructor here. And we're going to give it a name, description, the endpoint name of where we're going to send this deployment to, right? Where it's going to be wrapped into the model, compute, the instance count, all of the settings around the compute. We're also going to give it the output action. Remember that we're going to batch everything, so we want to know where the results go to. In this case, predictions.csv. And how it's going to handle that, we're going to append to this file, right? So we're going to append rows to that file. And a few other settings like retrying and all that, but basically it's different because it's just settings that kind of represent doing a batch. So let's get this submitted. And similar to our online endpoint, this can take a little bit of time to really go. However, not as much time, because in this case, we're not really getting it to go. We don't need the compute to go running or anything like that. So we can move on. So let's talk about the default deployment that I'm highlighting here. It's important that with batch endpoints that we actually specify a default deployment and set that, because when a caller comes over to call this, they don't have to specify which deployment they're using. So I'm running that. What did I forget? I think I might have been just a little fast on this. All right. So let me run that again. And yeah, so just, that should have ran okay. That's all done. All right, so I think I was just a little fast on this, and that's probably fine. So let's run that again. There we go. So that submitted okay. So again, we can have multiple deployments in there, and making sure the default is there is just if somebody calls it without doing it, it's fine. All right, let's set up the data for this. So when we use it, we want to have a bunch of data for it. So let's look at what I have here to test it. So a bunch of patient data. So I think there's 100 rows in each one of these, something like that. They're not terribly big, but we're going to set it up as a data asset, right? So this is going to be a URI folder, and we're going to go and create that asset so we can use it. So this is the data that we're going to send to the batch to go and score. So this goes pretty fast, right? We're just setting up that data set. And at this point, we just want to retrieve it to make sure that we're getting the data set, the unlabeled data set, back from the machine learning service. And then we're going to submit the job, right? So when we call a batch deployment, we need to send the data. So our input is going to be that data, and we're going to send that to the endpoint. Remember that when we trigger batch endpoint, we're really saying, hey, go spawn a job and do all this. So when we create the endpoint, when we invoke it rather, we need to pass that input data that we just specified, right? And then we're going to just retrieve that job back. So let's give this a go. Oh, what did I miss? You know what? Yeah, sir. Okay, so it's not, for some reason I was thinking something was still deploying, but let me go back and just look at this real quick. I think I just forgot something very silly. And, oh, you know what? This is what happens when I try and talk through this a little too fast. So setting the input, we forgot to run that. So now that we have the input, let's go and create that endpoint. Let's invoke that endpoint with the input. Now, this is going to take a while because it needs to spawn the job. The job needs to go and create the compute and everything, have that getting really started. And then it has to do all the predictions to actually process the data in batch. And this isn't really set with a lot of compute in this example, so it'll take a little bit longer. And then we'll get the results after that. Okay, so let's leave that go, and we'll keep an eye on it. here and there, and we'll see how that works. Since this video has been pre-recorded, we've sped up this section to save you a bit of time waiting for this to complete. All right, so we're still waiting for this. I'm just going to make a small little change here. Let's just edit this cell. So I'm going to get rid of making that endpoint. So we just retrieved the status of the job, right? So it's that wasn't updated. So it's running. Just want to see if it was complete or not. So let's give it a tiny bit more time. And once it's running, usually doesn't take too long to go, but it will take a little more time to finish. This part of the process can take some time, so let me hit my magic fast forward button to jump to the good stuff. All right, there we go. We just got the notification in, so it looks like the batch is completed. So let's just double check here. And yeah, sure enough, it is marked as completed. That's great. So let's go look at the results for this. So what we're going to do is we're going to download the output name score. So where the scoring is going to, we're going to download that to a local path for this script, right? So we're going to do that, and that will let us to go and read the predictions like CSV and stuff like that. So we got that. Let's go see if we can read that. So that data is all read. All the stuff in the file is read in the data variable. So we're going to just do a little cleanup here for new lines. But one of the things about this is it's going to kind of show up a little bit messy for that. There's a kind of an error in it, but don't worry about that. The point is that we're actually reading the data, and we can see the results from it. Now, it's a little hard to interpret here. So what we'll do is I'll show you where this is in with the job as well, right? So let's yeah, I think we're good here. So let's jump over and see the data in another spot. Right? So yeah, that's just an error come back. I wasn't sure if it was just there a little bit fast, but it that CSV file predictions is actually, because we downloaded it, it's actually just sitting here. Let me just refresh this. Sitting here in our local folder, right? So when we download it, so the predictions, a little easier to see. What this basically is the file on the right-hand side has a bunch of rows, and we see the predictions in the middle here, right? So see a lot of people getting predicted to have diabetes. The way over on the left-hand side is the row identifier, so we see the different rows from the file. So patient data 1, right, is marked to be diabetic, and so we do see the results of what's going on. So it's basically which row in that file is coming back for that. So with that, we do see the predictions coming back. That's what we're looking for. It's a lot of data that was all processed at once. That's what a batch endpoint is really designed for. So, all right, with that, let's jump back to the content where we're going to wrap up this video and wrap up the entire course. Just to wrap up our section on working with batch endpoints, if anything goes wrong, we'll need to troubleshoot it. As we've seen, a batch endpoint runs as a job, so troubleshooting is really just a matter of just looking at the job execution. However, the actual scoring process will show up as a child job. And under the Outputs and Logs tab, you can find some job status files under the Logs user directory. Specifically, you can see a job error text file that will summarize any of the errors in the script. You can see a job progress overview file that will give you high-level information about the number of mini batches that were processed, for example. And you can see a job results text file that will show you any errors with calling the init or run function specifically that would be in your scoring script. And with that brings us to the end of this video on deploying models and to the end of our course. I sincerely hope that this video series has helped you with your learning journey with a better understanding of the Azure Machine Learning Service. Since we're at the end of the course, I'd like to take a moment to remind everybody about the importance of certification. Certification is a great way for you to confirm how well you know how to use the Azure Machine Learning Service. And to reiterate a point that I made at the beginning of this video series, is that you can really think about certification as the goal to your learning journey. So you can think of all the topics on the DP-100 certification exam as being all the things that somebody that's working in this space should know about the Azure Machine Learning Service. That means if you really want to be a professional working in a space, you really should be at the level where you could pass the exam easily. And one way that I like to phrase this is that you will find out one of two things if you do the exam. Either you pass the exam and walk away with the confidence that you know your stuff, or the exam doesn't go as well as you'd hope. You can think of it as somebody simply pointing out some additional things that you should know. And in that sense, I would much rather that you make your mistakes on the exam where you can walk away, learn it, and then come back and try again, rather than making those mistakes on a real-life project, which can have some really serious consequences. And with that final thought, I wish you all the success in your future, and I hope we see each other again. Thank you for watching.